Grifter's Bible, a novel by El Shaboons, read by El Shaboons, with sound design by Monumental Sonic Architecture. Chapter 8. When your bell is rung, it's time to get up. How long will you lay there, O sluggard? When will you arise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man. Dull silver ripples of obnoxious Doppler dappled the black ocean tide of my consciousness as I was drawn towards the surface against my will. My liquefied eyes emerged into the muted television blue light of a darkened hospital room. A strange and stale brown coating covered my fat tongue in sweaty chode musk. I spit tiny bits of fur or tobacco, something moist and dank as a crack, through my chapped lips, but I couldn't get the wang of bilirubin and leather to leave the tip of my tongue. Are you finally done taking a dump all over creation? That voice again. I looked to my side and I could make out the blurred shape of Seth's hair flickering in the light from the television screen as he shook his head slowly. How'd you hear about that? I rasped as puzzle pieces began meandering into place. That was Dwayne's mom you unloaded on. Seth snorted. You're shitting me. Not as much as yourself. She finished cleaning the diarrhea off of your and even sent some girl all the way to Bulk Mart to get the solvent to clean all the glue and burnt rubber off your skinners. I looked down and beheld my mummified palms. She said I got electrocuted. Seth held up a halting hand. Don't get dramatic, sister. It's not like you got hit by lightning or the cross. How do you know? I read your chart while I was waiting for you in the emergency room. What kind of hospital lets you in the ER? I groused. Seth kept watching the yellow closed captioning flashing at the bottom of the muted screen and replied, I get where I want to go, Glasses. You know the deal. Do you know when they're going to release me? I don't know that, he shrugged. But it's not up to them. He reached behind and to his left for something on the ledge of the sink. He tossed my pants onto the foot of the bed. I need you back at work, oh great technician. Seth gave the discharge desk a phony address to forward the bill to, and we skedaddled with a script and 3 refills for hydrocodone. Back at the loft, the usual Monday buzz of our private beehive was zipping along at its standard manic clip. All of the street team's backs were bent towards triage and the rehabilitation of the interior of the sanctuary on the morning after our secret catastrophe. Scanning from the narthex back to the stage, I watched our swarm of daubers dutifully patching over the wreckage that followed the explosion of the batteries, straightening the disorder left over from the previous evening's upheaval and the less than harmonious exodus of the flock out the door. Beneath the knot of her headscarf, cerebellum sobered over auburn eyes surveyed the different clutches of workers, and she directed each group on where to sweep next, which pews still needed tending, and how to scrub the black burn marks on the western wall where the iron disc had regurgitated a spurt of latent electricity which had been transmitted into the drywall and blown out through the soundproof paneling. Lips Ahoy and Chester Doors led a 2-line bucket brigade sloshing soapy water from the shower in the downstairs bathroom out to 2-man crews swabbing the carbon scoring and charred dark circles from off of the face of the wall. When your bell is rung, it's time to get up, Seth summarized the situation. I judged how untouched the lion's share of the main room was. Yeah, I imagine we could probably be back in presentable business before Christmas. I could see the various members of the street team divert their attentions from the cleaning to the conversation I was having with Seth. A cowl of hush fell over their faces when I mentioned the possibility of no shows until Christmas. It was as if someone had set a cake dish over the bat phone so that the unfolding of the next few moments would go undisturbed. I heard a cough, a burp, and then one last sweep of a broom. Seth bent in too and leaned down to speak closely into my face. Next show's this coming Sunday. Same time, right here. Seth said it extra loud and a lot of them lit up like Christmas had come early.
Oh yeah, I know.
A mumbling hum of excitation broke out among the street team as they elbowed and hugged one another now that Brother Joe had clarified that there would be no break in the shows, no respite from the holy presence. I'm not playing around about that proverb. We can't afford the break. Seth tweezed his fingers together. We're this close to getting my board back from Vince, and I'm not stopping now. It had been almost a year since Seth had shamefacedly pawned his beloved mixing rig and blown the proceeds on 8 balls, a steak dinner, and satellite TV. He had built the electronics by hand, and his homemade mixing desk hot-rodded his reputation as an alpha in the recording industry. And then he had pawned the board off in the deepest of the cocaine doldrums that had consumed him. It felt like Superman had hawked his cape the day I saw the mixing board-sized chunk missing from the studio floor. And once the drugs were gone, all I ever heard was how Seth was going to get the board back. It had become his mission, and that made him unstoppable. There was inertia, there was entropy, and Seth was going to get his board back. Stop acting like an old lady. You don't need that long. You need to get your gear and hustle. I'll give you 15 minutes. Take some of your pills, get some coffee, take a dump if you still got any left in you, whatever. Then get your ass upstairs and figure out what you gotta do to get back to humming come Sunday. We're getting that board back. I'm not gonna let you blow up for nothing. As I dragged my aching body down the access tunnel, I remembered being rescued. There was the return of the dim memory of tiny hands pawing at my body and pulling me down the access tunnel like Celia. Fujitsu was the only person small enough to fit in the tunnel, so he had been sent to the rat's nest to retrieve me after the blow-up. He had also pulled my laptop to save it from being destroyed. I used my one unbandaged thumb to turn my laptop on. I heaved a sigh of relief when it blinked into waking like it should. I pecked in my password and the graphical interface popped up out of a benign state of blue hibernation. The last functioning mandalas frozen in their startup state of pixelated white. The screen filled with a ribbon of swimming algorithms skimming through the lower third. Commands were still being sent to the outputs, even though the computer wasn't connected to the relay. My stomach rumbled at the thought of Fujitsu seeing all of the old black patented apps that I had written at IM. Whenever I thought about IM, I thought about the theft of the relay. And when I thought about stealing the relay, the future went black and wild. I went over to the crawl space and started pulling ceiling panels out from on top of the batteries to try to forget. I reasoned myself down off of the ledge. Fu wouldn't know what to say. If pressed by any potential investigators, he would likely only be able to describe the rapid flashing of the synchronized mandalas that I had designed as a visual interpretation of the beast heartbeat. He couldn't call it if he tried. As far as I knew, there were only 3 other people capable of interpreting the data on the screen. There was James Abraham, and he was still locked up in Timberglen. His boy Joey had been James's assistant during the years of the beast's existence. Then there was Chuck Vu, and he was just as culpable in the theft of the relay from IM as Seth and I were. Chuck and I were in deep in all this together. We had been for some time. My mind wandered back through our fractured history as my gauzy fingers played over the spindly spiderwebs, black plastic sleeving, and copper thread that connected the blown battery to the rest of the cradle. Number 16's casing had exploded and made the plastic bubble and pock across the top of most of the units. It had melted away whole corners from off of the neighboring cells. I remembered how I had jumped at the gig when I heard that Dr. Abraham was coming to Texas to set up a skunk works to fulfill his contractual obligations to the Navy after the mysterious flame-up in Guantanamo Bay had destroyed his lab. The soup to nuts that I could gather cast Dr. Abraham as the avant-garde of industrial technology. His reputation as an early juncture point of neuroscience and magnetic hardware was unimpeachable. When you're in the industrial trenches, inspiration is hard to come by if you're hoeing an R&D row for the military. I threw in. Dr. Abraham's contract with the Navy had required him to deliver an encyclopedia of the senses written in binary code with an illustrated graphical interface that could be standardized, synced to devices, and taught to individual operators like sonar tech or Morse code. The memory of James at the peak of his powers just gave me the blues, so I decided to go ahead and pull the affected battery out to occupy my mind. I stacked the useless marine cell next to the spools of wiring and jack connectors by the port. I set the largest of the loose ceiling panels on the floor of the access way and nearly gave myself a hernia heaving the junked battery and hardware on top of the panel like hors d'oeuvres on a tray. I knotted a hank of cable through a blown hole in the panel so I could pull the load back down the hall behind me. Chuck was the hardware specialist that James had selected from the most recent crop of engineering drafts to sign on at IM. The job was to prototype and demo highly portable devices that could mimic the various artificial neurological phenomena that James had developed at Camp X-Ray. My shoulders were pulsing as I dragged the heavy skiff of wreckage behind my dusty butt towards the light of the landing. The cable harness dug into the remaining bandages on my palms. My earliest chit-chat with Chuck Vu was concerned with his doctoral thesis on the use of supermagnets to control subharmonic vibrations and overtones, and how to harness them for crowd control during mass riot situations. Chuck had pulled out his phone while we waited for James to arrive, and he showed me a photo of the black angle iron pylon wreathed in snaking cables and reinforced cones that had been his final project before he doctored up in 2003. The powder-coated tower of speakers that made a steel-girded structural column in the building where he demoed his creation ripple like a slack rope, and he just barely powered down before the ceiling could collapse. His research had led him to become proficient in repairing and constructing speakers, and while his thesis was fine-tuned for presentation, Chuck had made ends meet by building custom amps for bands around Boston where he went to school. All of the parts he used to make these amps are stolen from his school lab, but he finished his final project before any questions could be asked. Chuck had all sorts of petty skeletons in his closet like that. I black-taped the blown wiring in the rat's nest while I listened to Seth through the barrier wall. He was busy fleecing favors out of the flock. He was putting the word out on the electric grapevine that Sunday's show was most definitely on, and that anyone and everyone should definitely show up to witness just exactly how hard we would come back when we came back born again hard. I was scooting ass first into the crawl space with the flashlight in my teeth to retrieve the last few fistfuls of blown wiring when Seth started hollering, "Glasses!" I turned around and slithered back out. "Phone! Hurry up!" He goaded as I squirmed down the accessway. "Who is it?" I wiped my hands off on my pants and walked towards Seth's proffered phone. "Chuck," is all his silent lips would allow. I took the phone like it was AIDS and just stared at Seth. We had assumed radio silence after the theft of the relay. We agreed on no phones until the heat had died down, no matter how curious or paranoid any of us ever got about the inevitable investigation that would follow at IM. Chuck should only be calling if the bloodhounds had him up a tree with a barking subpoena. My voice loitered in the dead space between my mouth and the phone. Anything to keep from answering. Seth nipped me on the titty. "See if he's got any speakers we can have," he whispered like Big Ben. "But don't stay on too long because I'm still waiting on my callback from Vince at All American." Seth couldn't have been less concerned with the whole brazen larceny of government property aspect of our grift. I could mention his complicity in the robbery, but I knew I'd get a blank stare or the brush off. His vision of the moment was focused on putting on that next show and paying off his debt to Vince. There was nothing else to do. I mushed the touchscreen up against my sweaty ear. "Hey," I sounded like a mouse. "Everything all right?" My voice was tight as the rings on a rat's tail as I waited to hear him unload the evil legal tidings that I foresaw on everyone's horizons. There was a pause like God himself wanted me to suffer. But then, from somewhere out of the void, there was a squeak. Good. I guess at least so far." I could hear something in Chuck's voice. I knew something was wrong. "Did it work? Your church, did it work or what?" I skeeved to answer any church-related questions over the phone. I paused and considered the implications. Seth tapped at my sleeve as he hissed a whisper. "Ask if he's got any amps." I swatted him away. It worked, sort of." I fretted over my answer. I stared down the line. "We were doing alright for a few weeks, but then we had a bit of a blow-up yesterday and lost our PA. "Amps," Seth mouthed. "Ask old Hootis about those amps he builds. We need sound. Today." I rolled my eyes at Seth. I tried to think of a way to insinuate PA talk into the train of the conversation. But before I could settle on a tack to take, Chuck closed the gap for me. "Oh yeah?" Chuck said. "Because that's why I called." I looked up at Seth like he was a witch. Chuck was a degenerate gambler. He and the odds are diametrically opposed to one another. To cover his nut on the domestic front, while at least paying off his weekly vig, Chuck was trying to get back to supplementing his salary at IM by building custom amps and speaker enclosures. But these bands in Dallas can't afford it. Chuck was cruel in his appraisal. Everybody thinks they're Pantera, but they got no money like high school. He had inventory stacking up, and it was just more weight around his neck. They're gonna cost me too much to store out here. I got a kid on the way and I need the space. I need to get rid of them quick. Chuck's young wife was all sorts of pregnant, and his incessant gambling had dead-legged his 5-year life plan. He sounded busier than a cat trying to break on a sidewalk. My eyes darted up to look at Seth closely. He must have seen something in my stare. Seth withdrew his fingers from my sleeve, set his ass on the arm of the couch, and clasped his two hands together as if he were some sort of curious but tolerant gentleman, a patient saint. As if. I spoke to the room for his benefit. So you're saying you're unloading amps for capital? Seth exploded into politely silent rapture, double fist punching at dust mites in the air, scrunching his face up like a gargoyle in the crapper. How did favors like this drop out of the sky and into his lap? How could one mortal man attract so much opportunity in a world where nothing truly supernatural occurs? Seth's eyes sparkled. He loved it. He could see that something magical was occurring between the phone's earpiece and my eyeballs. He looked like a father contemplating the face of his unborn son and heir floating behind the veil of liquor omni. What do you got? I teased out some line. I knew that Seth was cognizant of the presence of a big fish on the other end of the signal, but I wanted to feel some genuine tug on the line before I jumped into the circle jerk and committed myself to getting involved with Chuck again. I put a thumb over the mouthpiece and relayed Chuck's shopping list of finery. I clicked them off to Seth like so. 300-watt bass amps. Seth zooted his face up. His nose sniffed the air with the swish of a scythe singing through its arc. Seth's attention was fully invested in the relayed conversation. 6 480 power amps with some customized updates. Seth leered as if the attributes and physical specialties of a whore were being enumerated by a pimp. Seth punched the air in rapid kung fu. I knew sooner or later that I was going to have to put aside my trepidations about meeting up with Chuck again. Alright. I spoke into the phone as I weighed out when I would be done in the rat's nest. Then I translated that sum into days. We can make it up there on Friday. From out of the blue, the phone was ripped from my bandaged hand, and when I turned to see where it went, I saw Seth lifting the phone to his lips. We'll see you in an hour, he barked into the mouthpiece, and then closed the call before Chuck or I could react. Within 10 minutes, I was sitting on the bench seat between Billy Goat and Seth, with Evil shivering in my lap. Billy Goat's ancient Ford climbed the ramp out of deep element on the northbound 75. Billy Goat left the freeway in Richardson and prowled through the barren feeder arteries of the tech corridor. We slunk through the desolate rows of empty office buildings and strip centers that used to house and service embryonic internet startups and evolving telecom giants before the tech bubble blew. We reached the outskirts of the silicone suburbs where the families that had begun to blossom during the pre-millennial boom were learning what the downside looked like, as the Great Recession pied them just as hard as it hit everyone else. It only made sense that Chuck needed money. Between the economy, the new baby, and his old habits, it was a wonder he hadn't done something desperate already. Any anxiety that I harbored over meeting up with Chuck soon appeared unfounded. No black helicopter shadowed our arrival. There were no Crown Vics or Hummers blockading our exit once Billy Goat turned onto Chuck's street. In fact, it was like the Stepford serenity that reigned on Chuck's block had probably gone on virtually unbroken until the moment when Seth thrust his finger out the window of the truck and howled. There he is, boys. That's the man I come looking to see. Assalamu alaikum, my little brother, and a baba booey to you all. Billy Goat shot his tailpipes and Evil started vibrating in my lap. I followed the sound of Evil's growling to the tubby Vietnamese nebbish waving at us with a smoking camel in his hand. Chuck Vu in the flesh. That flesh was covered in a leisurely variation on his standard daily work attire. A starch-scorched white shirt buttoned right up to his collar and tucked into khaki shorts with white socks and shower shoes in place of the pants and weegeons he wore at IM. He was just grinning his little ass off and puffing on smoke. Hallelujah, you old horn dog. I hear you're about to be my new best friend. Seth had one foot out the door and he was already wheeling and dealing. Chuck had a pot belly, and he wore thick round specs that magnified the bags of sallow flesh that clung to the underbelly of his hooded eyes. You looking good, Slim? Seth bounded over with his hand thrust forward to shake Chuck's. Ah! Chuck looked amused, but still slightly overwhelmed. He talked with a straight-off-the-boat Vietnamese accent. Hi, how you? He smiled and bowed to Seth's approaching figure. Hi, how you? He smiled and bowed again as Seth's shadow loomed over his own. Hi, how you? He smiled and bowed until Seth was on him. Dude, I'm killer. Now put her there, soul brother. How's your situation is the question. Seth grinned and barreled over everything in his path. Chuck looked stunned as his hand was consumed by Seth's best professional huckster's grip. Chuck said he had successfully sidestepped suspicion of complicity in the robbery of the relay, often slipping into this cartoonish Southeast Asian twang until he was able to squeak back into the woodwork at IM after only 3 security interviews somehow cleared him. Conversely, the innocent security guard had been fired and arrested when his drug test came back dirty for the Soma. Most of the investigation was being focused onto his unfortunate shoulders. When he was done putting my fears to rest, Chuck turned to me and smiled. He never said hello. He did something I'd never expect. Chuck came right over to me, nodded, and then put his arms around me in a profoundly uncomfortable embrace. You look like a dried up old dog turd, man. He drew back out of it and smiled. Gay kakanaf and yum. I figured if we were still joking with one another, things were probably okay. Hey, are you gonna kiss or are we gonna go look at this wall of sound I've been hearing about? Seth took back control of the meeting. Chuck bungled into a symphony of sorry for Seth and Billy Goat's sake. He recommended that Evil stay in the truck because Chuck had something that he wanted to show us that might make her little bowels boil. Go on, you. Billy Goat spoke softly. Just wait for me. Evil sniffed, and then clicked her way back to the truck. She jumped through the open door and made herself at home in the cab. Come on! Chuck beckoned us all into his soundproof garage. Our eyes adjusted to the new light, and I saw a labyrinth of black plywood obelisks that looked like totem poles honoring some colossal cyclops. Speaker cones arrayed up the entire 10-foot height of each pylon. At their feet, black snakes with fabric-jacketed innards lay headless and defeated on the floor. Stacks of polypropylene cones littered the battlefield like burial mounds, and a tired welding mast perched atop the arc welding rig hung its shielded eye in victory, guarding the order of the tools hanging from the pegboards mounted all along the width of the back wall. Chuck Vu handed us each a pair of orange foam earplugs and then led us past several piles of spent sticks of flux. There were 4 6-foot-tall naugahyde cabinets that were more horn and cone than plywood. We wandered past large floor cabinets and orange and green vinyl jalopies with sparkling silver faceplates and aluminum dials that were required to withstand the tremulous quaking that these amps could create. At the end of the aisle stood a custom-built enclosure that Chuck introduced as the Earth Mover. It's a keyboard amp, Chuck snickered to himself. I guarantee you run your organ through this, and your first 5 rows are gonna levitate. Chuck turned slightly and motioned. This here's the mountain. Guitar sounds like something big is coming down. Nice avalanche. Seth was almost slobbering. I want that. Fat. He's still moaning over losing his stack. That's the way Seth did it. He'd extract your blood, sweat, and tears in the course of doing his thing, but then he'd give you orange juice and a cookie to ease the pain. Finally, Chuck showed us the Leviathan, an ungodly creation that was the reason why Chuck told us to leave Evil outside. Can it create the brown note? Seth referenced the fabled frequency that is so low that it makes listeners shit their pants. Chuck said, yes, without a hint of humor, and then he put his earplugs in. Chuck motioned us forward into an alcove formed by 3 stacked pairs of customized 4-way speakers with huge mid-ranged horns, shielded tweeters, and double 15-inch woofers in each unfinished casing. Chuck Vu picked up his guitar, wiped off the neck, and put the strap over his cheap chili bowl of salt and pepper hair that was growing dangerously thin by the age of 30. He looked at Billy Goat and said, here's why the puppy couldn't come, and flipped the power amps off of standby. Chuck leaned into a subharmonic stoner riff that made the hair on my arms stand up. Those hairs hooted on waves of sound with each bend and bass note. Chuck hunkered in concentration with his tongue sticking out of the side of his mouth as he double-tapped his fingertips along the uppermost octaves of the fretboard. I felt a rapid ripple of sound pushing air in front of each speaker, and the effect was like 100 rabbits thumping soft lightning paws up and down my body and face. The tip of Chuck's toe tapped at a delay pedal, and he palmed the whammy bar, sending out an awful moan like someone had sampled and chopped up the yawning howl of the earth writhing in pain. The vibrations ran through my toes and feet, all the way up my ankles until my knees shook. The demonstration made it plain. With this equipment in Seth's hands, we'd be better off than we ever were before. Much better than the bricolage of borrowed equipment that had blown up. Plus we had a cellar over a barrel, and that was likely foremost in Seth's mind. Well, cool, dude. You really got some stuff to be proud of here. He paused, and a look crossed his face. What you also got is a baby on the way from what I hear. Seth looked at me, and I nodded almost coldly. He carried on. You know, you got your gambling thing, and I'm not trying to judge you on any of that. But the thing is, you're a little behind the 8 ball with this economy, man. There ain't a bar band within 1,000 miles of this place that's in enough of a situation to buy even one piece of this gear. These specs are hot, but they're not going to do anyone any good sitting out here in the dirt. So I reckon you're going to have to take whatever you can get for this. His face did a silent calculation, and the sooner that happens the better, because it's not like this economy's on the verge of perking up, my son. Seth reached over and put a firm hand on Chuck's soft shoulder. He stabbed his other hand in his pocket. Let me show you what the best offer you're likely to get looks like. He extracted a wad of green that hurt my chest to look upon. There was a lot there, but it must not have looked like much to Chuck in exchange for what Seth said he was gunning for. The bills were faded and ironed smooth by dried out sheep sweat and the body heat from the flock. Chuck's eyes closed in silence. He seemed to reset his inner clockworks. He took a breath. Seth took the rubber band off of the roll. It's a buyer's market, but you've been nothing but a friend to us. I'll give you this. Seth rotated his offer in front of Chuck's face. If you throw in the mountain on top. Chuck took the bills and stared down at them. He looked hollowed out. I felt bad for him because that equipment was worth way more than the time it took Chuck to finish thumbing through the sheaf of 20s. Okay. Those are the only 2 English syllables that Chuck could get out between his gritted teeth. The rest was heated Vietnamese mumbling and counting from 1 to 10. It took 3 trips to get all that gear back to Deep Ellum. The lengthening afternoon filled the sanctuary as the street team came back home. The crew lingered in delirium, listening to Seth warming up various speaker combinations as we waited for each load from Chuck's to arrive. Lester and the rest of them grew busier and busier as we lined the stage with speakers. Upstairs, I made the final connections to the new battery the barrel had dropped off while we were gone to Chuck's. I synced the laptop to the relay to the battery array. I ran through the setup program while Seth got everything downstairs the way he wanted. Around dusk, I started sending the initial burst patterns into the hall. A laugh rang out somewhere downstairs, and I looked from my laptop to the little window in the rat's nest. Clouds had clotted to blot out the deep purple firmament with bruised cumulus. The tiniest green and red fleshed hummingbird that I have ever seen vibrated at the crack in the pane. I pushed the window the rest of the way open and it lit on the verge, sitting there, watching me work. The beast came back online, and a vibration was in the air. I heard the front door blown open downstairs. A mute deluge began to fall on the streets outside. The sound of wings filled the spaces between each drop. Thunder cracked and a blast of pigeons surged into the rat's nest through the opening. They whipped past me on their way down the access tunnel. I jumped in to follow them. When I made it to the bottom of the stairs, I saw the pigeons orbiting up around the skylight. Squadrons of mockingbirds charged through the front door and into the electrified sanctuary. They strafed the magnetic field as I stepped up onto the stage where Seth was getting a mic set up in front of my tom-tom so he could run it through one of the overdriven orange amps that we'd bought. Dwayne was feeling around for his footing on the organ after routing it through the earth mover and syncing the amps to the acoustics of the room. Butterflies and the lone hummingbird clung to the walls like living ornaments lining the 8 faded circular burn marks. I looked out the door and saw an old crow pecking on a chalky old dog turd and dunking the chunks in a puddle by the curb. Billy got closed and locked the front door, and then he sat down in the back pew with Evil on the periphery of the magnetic field. Seth checked his mic for sibilance and feedback, and when there was none, he told me to count everyone in. Then I did.
1, 2, 3, 4.